Welcome to the G5 having our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review. Today, we'll be taking a look at the Nevada Wolf Pack, who finished 2-10 last season. They wrapped up their 2024 spring practice with their spring game on April 13th. We have a special guest joining us today. He covers Nevada athletics and many other things over at Nevada Sports Net. He is a Home Alone stan. He is Christopher Murray. Chris can be found at by Chris Murray on X. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Love to have you here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you into being interested in sports journalism and covering the Wolfpack?
Well, that is a long story. I did go to the University of Nevada. My brother was a journalism major, 2 years older than me. So I got into journalism as well. My first semester in school, he switched his major because he realized that journalists work long hours and make very little money. He ended up becoming a teacher, so he picked a job that pays even fewer money and you work even longer hours. So I'm not sure that was the smartest move, but he's become a very successful third grade teacher in town. And yeah, I started at the newspaper in town here when I was just a sophomore in college, 18 years there. And then the last 5 years at Nevada Sports Net, as you mentioned, we broadcast a lot of Wolfpack events, including Nevada football games. I write for our website, nevadasportsnet.com. I've been a voter in the AP Top 25 since 2012 in men's basketball and football. So been doing it for about 22 years, but I started when I was 19 years old, going to the University of Nevada, which I've covered ever since then.
All right. So in the offseason, Nevada fired head coach Ken Wilson, which means they have a new leader of the pack in Jeff Choate. He comes to Nevada being the linebackers coach at Texas. What can you tell us about Coach Choate and what he brings to the table for the Wolfpack?
It's a different personality from Ken Wilson. Ken Wilson gave a lot of years to Nevada. He was either an assistant coach under Chris Alt or on Alt's administration as an associate athletic director for 22 years. So, he had a lot of roots with the Wolfpack. He spent 9 years in the Pac-12 at Washington State and at Oregon. So came to Nevada 2 years ago and went back-to-back 2-10 seasons. A new athletic director was in charge. So the plug was pulled on him. And Jeff Choate brings a lot of energy, brings a lot of passion. This is a guy that's very high energy. He's very contagious. He's very motivational. And he's been a head coach before, which is different than Ken Wilson. Ken Wilson had never been a head coach before, even though he was in his upper 50s. Jeff Choate spent 5 years at Montana State and had a lot of success there. He ended up actually stepping down because the pandemic year 2020, FCS wasn't playing any football, got an offer to be co-defensive coordinator at Texas and linebackers coach. He had worked at Boise State with Texas's defensive coordinator at the time. So decided to make that move. It was a tough move because whenever you're a head coach, you don't want to take that step back, but he figured eventually he'd be able to become a FBS head coach if he did make that move. And, a couple of years later, that was the case. So, at Nevada, he inherits a big rebuild. You're talking about 4-20 over the last 2 years, 16 of those 20 losses by double digits. Last year, average margin of defeat of 16 points per game. Last 2 years, Nevada's had more interceptions and touchdown passes in both of those seasons. So, this has been a proud program for a lot of its history. Prior to the last 2 years, they had made a bowl game in 14 of the previous 17. But certainly he's taking it at a low point. He's going to try and get it back to at least the bowl level and maybe to a Mountain West championship level, which Nevada has not been able to reach since joining the Mountain West in 2012.
Well, as it often happens when you get a new head coach, that means new assistants and coordinators. Nevada's no different in that regard. Coach Choate brings over Matt Lubbock to be his offensive coordinator. Lubbock was previously an analyst at Kansas. Can you describe the type of offense that Coach Lubbock brings with him and plans to run there at Nevada?
So it's a unique situation because Coach Lubbock wasn't with Nevada during spring camp. He was actually still battling leukemia. The prognosis is very, very good. So he was able toward the end of spring camp to do some, Zooms and be a little bit more involved remotely. He should be on campus here when fall camp starts in late July. Nevada's playing a week 0 game, so they start a little bit earlier. But, you look at the history, and I think it's going to be a run-oriented kind of offense. When Jeff Choate was at Montana State, they ran the ball just shy of 65% of the time. Their quarterbacks were very involved in the run game. Coach Choate likes to call it a vertical run, vertical pass attack. He does want to get the ball down the field with the passing game, and he thinks the best way to do that is by making people have to stack the box, being able to get 5 yards per carry. So I think when you look at Nevada's offense, it's going to be a lot more run first than it was during its last successful tenure. That being the Jay Norvell tenure. Jay Norvell was Nevada's head coach from 2017 to 21. Ended up going in conference to Colorado State over some quibbles about salary and facilities and other things of that nature. That was an air raid offense. So it took Ken Wilson a couple years to try and get more to a run-oriented offense. And I think Jeff Choate's going to be the same way. He's going to want to run the ball. And Nevada's offensive line has not really been all that good over the last decade. So I think that's the biggest area of improvement to establish the kind of offense Nevada wants to run under Jeff Choate.
Well, let's get to the position where it all starts on offense. That's the quarterback. Brendan Lewis returns, as well as A.J. Bianco. Lewis was the starter, but A.J. also saw some game action last year. And then the new staff brings in Chuba Purdy from Nebraska. How did the quarterback room look in the spring, and did anyone emerge as a starter?
No, nobody emerged as the starter, and honestly, they're not going to name a starter probably until a couple of days before their season opener, August 24th against SMU. Brendan Lewis did have some really good play when he was at Colorado in 2021. He started the Buffalo's 2022 opener, then was benched and hit the portal before Deion Sanders was named the head coach. So, he was Nevada's primary starter last year. He was not very effective. I think that was more scheme-based and personnel around him based than anything. This is a former four-star prospect who's had success in the Pac-12. He's a very good athlete. He can run the ball. He doesn't have a lot of history of success getting the ball down the field. A lot of it's been more horizontal passing. And I think the chief opponent is going to be Chuba Purdy. He is the younger brother of Brock Purdy. He has started games at Florida State and Nebraska, hasn't been able to retain those starting positions. Was actually committed to San Jose State, a Mountain West foe of Nevada, right before Brent Brennan ended up going to Arizona. Reopened up his recruitment after that, and about a week later, he committed to Nevada. He was limited in spring camp. He was coming off an injury, so he wasn't full contact until about the last week or two. So maybe you didn't get to see the full Chuba Purdy. But those two, plus a junior college recruit, Anthony Grigsby Jr., he was at the College of San Mateo. Probably like legitimately listed at, he's listed at 5'11". He's probably closer to 5'9". But Jeff Choate seems to really, really like what he has in terms of his overall package. And you mentioned A.J. Bianco as well. He's a kid from the Hawaiian Islands. He did play a little bit as a true freshman last year. Had some ups and downs. He's a really good athlete. But I think when all is said and done, I think Brendan Lewis is going to start. If things don't go well with him, I think Chuba Purdy is next in line, and then probably Grigsby even before Bianco. But I know Jeff Choate likes the depth of that position. You're talking about two former four-star commitments and, three guys who had Power 5 offers coming out of high school. So I think the talent is there. The scheme has just been very problematic the last couple of years in getting the most out of those talents.
Moving over to the running game, their leading rusher and workhorse back from 2023, Sean Dollars, returns. They also brought in a lot of guys from the portal. Makes sense. You said they want to run that ball. Patrick Garwo, the second, transfers in from Boston College. Post-spring guys like Destin Hawkins from Syracuse, Kai Woods, and Savion Red both come from Texas. Of the guys that were there in the spring, how did the running back room look to you?
So there were a lot of injuries, unfortunately. Sean Dollars was kind of one of the healthy guys. He originally came from Oregon, was on Nevada's roster last year, like you said, led the team in rushing touchdowns. He's more of an all-purpose back than a kind of between the tackles back. Unfortunately, he did had to get carted off at the end of their spring game. They basically ended the game when he suffered an injury. We believe it to be a concussion. He also missed some games last year with a concussion, so that's definitely something to track. Patrick Garwo, he's the guy who's been all conference in the ACC at Boston College. He missed all of spring camp with an injury. Ashton Hayes, he's a local Reno product who began his career at Cal, came to Nevada last year, tore his ACL. He also was out for spring camp. And then those three most recent guys you mentioned, a couple of guys from Texas and a kid from Syracuse, they're coming after spring camp. So you're talking about six guys who have played power conference football. Just not a lot of them have been healthy in terms of recently, but I do think it could be a solid position. I think more, I'm looking at the offensive line to become better. Like Chris Ault is kind of known for Nevada football. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame. He was the guy who created the pistol offense to get the most out of Colin Kaepernick, had 3 different tenures with Nevada, won more than 225 games with the Wolfpack, got him all the way up to 11th in the country in 2010. It was all about that offensive line. They had a lot of guys at skill positions get to the NFL like a Colin Kaepernick, but that offensive line was so dominant. Every year, three guys on the all-conference team, guys going to the NFL. Joel Bitonio might be a Pro Football Hall of Famer. It was probably his last great offensive lineman. He's now with the Cleveland Browns. Another kid named Austin Corbett won a championship Super Bowl with the Rams, now with Carolina Panthers. That offensive line was always dominant under Alt, and it has not been great the last decade since Alt resigned after the 2012 season. So I don't think the running backs are an issue from a talent perspective. I think there's enough there. If I had to guess, Patrick Garwo, Sean Dollars, those are probably your top two guys. But it really comes down to that offensive line being able to set the tempo and the tone for this team, which it's not really been able to do, even during some successful seasons over the last couple.
So you mentioned Sean Dollar suffered that injury there in the spring game. How's he doing?
He's doing well. He's expected to be fullback when training camp starts. So, it's always a concern when you're talking about multiple head injuries within a 1-year period. So that certainly is something to track. It was a very scary situation. They had to take the ambulance out. They had to mobilize him. And, they were just trying to do a couple of red zone drills to end camp. The spring game was more or less over, and they were going to do a couple of things in the red zone. And the first play of that red zone series was when he hit his head on the turf. So, he should be good and he should be healthy at the start of the season.
And you mentioned, having two backs there and not having a workhorse kind of like you did last year. Do you feel like it's a 50-50 split, 60-40, a hot hand approach? How do you feel like that's going to be this year?
I think it's a wide open position, just like a lot at Nevada. I think everybody got a fresh slate with Jeff Choate. I think Jeff Choate is very high on Patrick Garwo in terms of his leadership and his rushing ability. I think Sean Dollars comes with a lot of accolades as a high school recruit, and he did take on the majority of the load last year. So I think it's going to comes down to who's healthy too. Because you look at Patrick Garwo, he was All ACC second team 1 year. Outside of that, a lot of injuries. So it's who can be healthy. Obviously, those two guys from Texas, Jeff Choate was going against them. I mean, those guys were both walk-ons with the Longhorns, and obviously Jeff Choate, was running the defense, so those guys would have been on the scout team. So, I think we can sit here and try and predict who's going to get the most carries, but I think you got to get into the season and see who's, performing the best. If I had to guess, I would say Garwo was probably the leading rusher at the end of the year, but I certainly wouldn't rule out any of those other guys. I mean, Ashton Hayes is another one, the guy I mentioned originally from Reno, who began his career at Cal. He's a very, very fast back. But a lot of those guys are more like all-purpose backs. I think Garwo is more between the tackles guy, and I think that's the style of run game that Jeff Choate wants.
So what are your thoughts about those post-spring transfers? Are those more depth moves or with, injury concerns, or what were your thoughts around those guys?
So Nevada did lose 3 running backs to the transfer portal after spring camp. Cross Patton, he's actually the son of Big Boy from Outcast. He entered the portal. A couple of other kids who were younger in the program. You didn't see a lot of transfers for Nevada after the coaching change. You did see significantly more after spring camp as Jeff Choate got to get familiar with the players and vice versa. A lot of times that's the coach kind of saying, you probably don't have a role here. Let's find another home for you. So, I wouldn't be too alarmed. Nevada did lose, I think it was 16 players from the roster at the scholarship level after spring camp, but that was kind of by design to try and get a feel for each other. And then Jeff Choate had to make some decisions on, who's fully bought into his program. He's been pretty transparent that he basically wants like 80% of the team bought in for the season opener. He's not giving, delusions that everyone's going to be fully bought in. At the end of spring camp, he said it was right around 50%. So, I think that was some pretty natural attrition. And you did definitely see a lot of attrition at the running back position in particular.
Moving over to the wide receivers, they look quite a bit different in 2024. John Jackson III and Isaiah Crocker graduated. Delvion Campbell's off to South Carolina. Spencer Curtis hits the portal. Darian Wiley comes in from Louisiana Monroe, and then he goes off to Vanderbilt in the spring, and then Jamal Bell heads over to Baylor. How did the staff address these losses?
I think that's the biggest area of concern on the offense for me. I mean, they returned basically like a career 4 catches from all their returning wide receivers. And then they lost the key tight end, Kaleki Latu, began his career at Cal, went through the team with spring camp. And then his brother was actually the first defensive player picked in the NFL draft. He was out at the NFL draft. I think that kind of put him on radar for some teams and ended up transferring to Washington after the draft. So, you look at wide receiver, that's definitely the biggest area of concern. I think Cortez Brahma Jr., he's a transfer from West Virginia. I think he could play a big role. There's a local kid from Bishop Manogue High School in Reno. His name is Marshawn Brown. He's a guy who I think can get a lot of playing time. Nate Burleson, a lot of people might be familiar with him. He played in the NFL for a decade. Now is on the CBS morning show, both the news and the NFL Sunday show. His son, Nate Burleson II, is on the roster. He actually injured his hand, broke his hand during the spring game as well. But he's a very long, athletic, fast kid, just like his dad. So they're going to be relying on a lot of young guys, a lot of unproven guys at that wide receiver position. I think that's why I emphasize the run game even more, because you got questions at quarterback. With the last couple of years not going very well, you got questions at wide receiver, and then you got questions on the offensive line in terms of whether they can pass protect consistently. So you add those three up, and to me, you really do have to establish that run, just because the infrastructure is not quite there to be an effective passing team in year one under Jeff Choate.
It might be tough to answer right now, but who do you think lines up there week one against SMU at wide receiver?
Yeah, I think Cortez Brahma Jr., he's one of two representatives. Nevada's taking to Las Vegas for the Mountain West Media Days, so I don't think you do that unless you have the big role for him. I think Marshawn Brown, that is a kid who originally was born in Texas, moved to Reno, 6'4", was one of the fastest players in the state in track as well, and he had a really big spring game, caught a touchdown, showed like he was ready to go out there and play, so I think he's probably your number two guy. And then number three it's wide open. They did bring Charles Brown in. He's a transfer from Texas State, brought him in after spring camp. I think they're pretty excited about him. They actually did a volunteer softball game against local law enforcement in the AAA stadium here, and he was one of the better softball players. Not to say that's going to translate to football, but just shows that he's a really good all-around athlete. So those are probably your top three, with Nate Burleson the second in there as well. But it is very thin. I mean, Nevada has under Jay Norvell in that air raid, they had a ton of really good pass catchers. Romeo Dobbs is now with the Green Bay Packers. Cole Turner came here as a wide receiver, ended up being a tight end, but he was basically a wide receiver. He's now with the Washington Commanders. So they have not been able to replace those guys. Elijah Cooks, also during that Jay Norvell era, he's with the Jacksonville Jaguars. So you're talking about NFL level guys. And now, a couple years later, you're just hoping that these guys who are redshirt freshmen can go out there and play immediately. So, I think that's going to be a big ask for them. But if Brahma's probably going to be your top wide receiver this year.
Well, let's move over to the tight end room. Based off what you've seen and heard, can you describe for us how you expect the tight ends to be utilized in this Lubbock offense?
Yeah, I think you're going to see a lot more two tight end sets. As I mentioned, Kaleki Latu transferring was a big blow, because he was really the one guy who could stretch down the seam, who was a big threat in the passing game. They did bring in a transfer 260-pounder from Florida, Andrew Savani. He's a guy who's probably going to get some reps. He was injured during spring camp. They brought in a guy from Dartmouth, Jace Henry. He's 260 pounds, so I think he's going to get a lot of reps. But I think it's more like blocking tight end kind of situation. They've got a 6'7" kid from Australia, Jaden O'Rourke, who joined the team last year. He could get some reps. He'd be more of your passing guy. But I think it's they want the beef to be able to help the run game. Their tight ends coach, Virgil Green, played a decade in the NFL, Nevada alum, won a Super Bowl with the Denver Broncos. He's kind of young as a coach, and I think they're excited to see what kind of coach he can become. But there aren't a lot of game changers in terms of the pass game at that tight end position.
All right. We talked about it earlier and how important it is for this offense. Let's get to that offensive line. Senior left guard Zach Welch graduates, and their right guard Joey Capra hit the portal. They return left tackle Isaiah World, center Andrew Madrigal, and right tackle Frank Sposo. Dylan Lopez comes in from Oregon State. Spencer Lavelle from Kansas. Snoop Leota Amama comes from Virginia, and Jacobus Set comes in from Washington State. How did the unit look this spring, and are they ready to roll in this new offense?
Yeah, I think they looked okay. You mentioned a lot of those transfers. They got a lot of power conference transfers, which is always good. Not a lot of those guys played a ton. Spencer Lavelle's played a decent amount. He's been at 3 different schools: Cal, Kansas, Arizona State. I think the returners, there's reason to be hopeful. I think Isaiah World can be one of the better left tackles in the Mountain West. He was originally a basketball player in San Diego in high school. And, he's pretty relatively new to football being his primary sport. He's played a lot as a young guy, so I think he could be really good this year. Andrew Madrigal, he's a civil engineering major, very smart kid. He's a third-year starter at that center position, so I think he could be really solid as well. I think the group has a chance to be really good. I've just seen that they've really struggled the last decade plus. You go back to 2009, they've had 11 different offensive line coaches. That's really, really difficult to be able to build an offensive line, which usually takes a couple of years just because of how much weight you got to put on to be able to compete in a short order. So I think that is the big question mark on the offense in terms of if this is going to be an above average group. Nevada's been known for its offense really over the years because of Chris Alt. And the offense the last 2 years it was terrible. Like they were a terrible offensive unit that was scoring 15, 16 points a game, and that doesn't win at the college level. The offensive line is older, it's more veteran, and it's been bolstered by some of these power conference transfers. So I would give it probably an average grade, like a C plus during spring camp. And the big question is, can it get to be a B minus? Because I don't think it's going to be an elite group, but I think there's enough returning experience where it can be a pretty solid group in the Mountain West and can help them form the identity they're looking for, which is, like we said, that run game. I mean, in his introductory press conference, Jeff Choate said, "I'm going to run the down ball." Like he's not making any delusions about what he wants to do offensively. He wants to play old school football. It's what he did at Montana State. It's what he's used to, and it's what he wants to do in Nevada.
Did anyone stand out to take over those 2 guard spots?
I mean, not necessarily. There are some young players. Tyson Ruffins, he's an interior offensive lineman, and then Josiah Timoteo, he's a guard or a tackle body. Both those guys played the 4-game limit last year as true freshmen. So I would say those are 2 guys to watch out for. Ruffins in particular, I know they were pretty high on. So I think he's the guy who's probably going to win a job on the interior of the offensive line. But we also have like relatively small glimpses of the team. They've got 10 to 15-minute windows, usually during stretching times that we got to see. Obviously, we got to see the spring game, but Ruffins and Timoteo were guys that the last staff was high on. They both stayed with this staff, and both of them got some starts as true freshmen, and they didn't play in that last game because they didn't want to burn those redshirt years. So I think those guys could have some bright futures.
All right, Chris, if you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who would that be? And I'll leave it open to offensive linemen too.
And I will take an offensive lineman. I'll go with Isaiah World. I mean, like I said, this is a kid who was originally from San Diego. He was mostly a basketball player. He was recruited by Jay Norvell. Took him a year to kind of get to campus because we were kind of didn't know, what was going on with him. But since he's got here, he was thrown into the fire early. He was playing a little bit earlier than you'd like for a left tackle, doing that as a redshirt freshman. But he's a very athletic kid. I think he's a very competitive kid. I think he's got great length. He's 6'7". He's got all of the frame that you would want at that position. And you could see him get better during his 2 years as a starter. So now coming in to a junior year, he was all Mountain West honorable mention last year. That's a guy who I think you can pinpoint and say this guy could be top 2 or 3 at his position in the Mountain West. And it's a very key position. I mean, left tackle is obviously hugely important. So that's a kid that I would watch that might fly under the radar, who I think could potentially be an all-conference player, first or second team at the end of this year.
So moving over to the defense, as you might expect, there is a new coach leading the way for the Wolfpack defense. That's Kane Oone. He comes to Nevada from Boise State, where he's most recently served as the co-defensive coordinator and the safeties coach. What style of defense can we expect to see from the Wolfpack here in 2024?
Yeah, I think they want an aggressive defense. I think you're going to see a lot of blitzing. Kane was with Jeff Choate at Montana State. He was his defensive coordinator there. He was a 4-time All-American for the Bobcats as well. So he's kind of got those blue-collar roots. But, you look at the personnel, I think the edge positions, not a lot of proven production, but I think there's some pretty good talent there. You look at safety, again, not a lot of proven production, but the transfers, I think you could see why, they'd be excited about the safeties on this team. I think there are question marks about defensive tackle. I think middle linebacker is this team's strongest position, and I think cornerback's got some questions. So, when you add that all up, I think the run defense is going to be the most questionable aspect of the team because of the lack of proven defensive tackles and truly the lack of numbers there. But I do think on the outside of the defensive line, they could be very talented. So, I think you're going to have to see some blitzing and you're going to have to see some protecting of the box given the defensive tackle situation.
Well, let's move over to that personnel that's going to run Coach Ione's defense. Let's start with the defensive line. That unit took a hit in the transfer portal. They lost guys like James Hansen to Texas Tech, Sasefo Moyaki to Portland State, Deion Washington to Hawaii. However, the portal giveth two. They bring in 3 transfers. How did that unit look in the spring, and did anyone stand out?
Yeah, I think Henry Ikahihifo is somebody to watch out for. He was a really good prospect as a tight end coming out of high school. Actually played for Nevada for 2 seasons as a tight end, went to junior college, became a defensive player, then transferred to Cal, didn't play a ton there, then transferred back to Nevada last year. They thought he was going to be eligible. The NCAA said he was a 2-time transfer, said he had to redshirt. So that was really disappointing for him. I think it impacted last year's team. Eligible now for his last season of college. And I think that's a guy who could be a really good player at defensive end. He's moved all over the place. As we mentioned, they kind of made him more of a traditional defensive end last year. Now he's going to be more of like an edge outside linebacker, so he'll get to pass rush a lot more. Another guy to look at, Caden Johnson. He was a four-star recruit out of high school in Minneapolis. Actually played with Jalen Suggs and Chet Holmgren on AAU basketball teams. Both those guys now stars in the NBA. But he ended up playing for Wisconsin, and they're obviously well known for having great edge rushers over the years. He recently transferred to Nevada. He was here for spring camp. So those are two guys in particular I think are going to be on the field together a lot. And I think they're going to be very productive at defensive end. But I go back to defensive tackle. You mentioned James Hansen. He was a captain of this team last year, starting nose guard. And then Deion Washington, another very talented interior defensive lineman who transferred to Hawaii. So those are their two best interior defensive linemen. They've got a guy named Thomas Whitty, walked on, actually out of Alaska, now a scholarship player. I think he's probably going to be your best interior defensive lineman. But those nose tackles, those defensive tackles are definitely the area where you can look and be like, oh, this is probably the weakest position on the entire team.
Moving over to the linebackers, they look to be in good shape and have some depth this season. They did lose Davion Beckwell to Austin Peay and grabbed Austin Hamatu from Washington. How did the linebackers look in the spring?
Yeah, I think it's a strong position. Drew Watts is, to me, probably the best player on the team. He's a little bit of an undersized middle linebacker, 6 foot, about 230. He's in his third year as a starter now. He's a missile. He goes sideline to sideline. He's really fun to watch. Really emotional player. And then right next to him is a guy named Naki Matialona. He's out of Long Beach Cal Poly, which is a very strong high school program. He's also a third-year starter for this team. He's a senior. So those are two really good middle linebackers, probably both a little bit undersized, but they're very athletic. They're very fast. If they can get, that defensive tackle group to keep the offensive line off those two guys, they're going to make a lot of plays. So I think that's a position that you can pinpoint and say, oh, this is a really good group. This is a group that can be top 2 or 3 in the Mountain West. They've got experience. They're 3-year starters. They've been really productive. So that is a position that they were able to retain their top players, and they got to be really happy about that.
The defensive backfield had some key losses to graduation in Amini Johnson and Jaden Dedman. In fact, Johnson was the team's leading tackler a year ago. They also lost their second leading tackler from 2023 and Richard Tony Jr. to TCU. But the Wolfpack brought back a nice core group of guys like Kane Savage, KK Mayer, Michael Coates Jr., and Aiden Siwole. Is that how you say that?
Yeah.
All right, we're knocking it.
Yeah, there we go.
Suwelli?
Yeah, it's an interesting group. I mean, they do lose their top 3 tacklers. As you mentioned, Amani Johnson, he's now with the Cowboys, undrafted free agent deal. Richard Tony Jr. had a couple of pick sixes. He's now with TCU. That's where Ken Wilson actually ended up landing as a linebackers coach. So they lose some talent, but I think they brought in some talent as well. Keaton Crawford is a transfer from Texas. He was one of the best special teams player in the nation last year. He actually had an interception in the Big 12 championship game. He had an East-West Shrine Bowl invitation, but that was primarily as a special teams player. He wants to prove that he can be a 3-down safety. Didn't get to do that at Texas, so came with Jeff Choate to Nevada. I think he has a potential to be one of the better safeties in the Mountain West with his second senior season. Keyshawn Cobb, he's a transfer from West Virginia. Nevada had like 4 or 5 transfers from West Virginia this last year. He's a guy who's been really productive at the FBS level, albeit at Buffalo. Didn't play very much at West Virginia because of injuries. So those guys are probably going to be your starting safeties. Aiden Suwelli as well, probably going to be on the field as a starter. He can, play a couple different safety positions. So, among those 3, I think your safeties are pretty decent. KK Meyer played a lot as a redshirt freshman last year. He's going to be a starting cornerback, and then a competition for the other starting cornerback job. So, not a lot of productivity in terms of proven players in the secondary, but I do think there's a decent amount of talent there, and I think that group should end up being pretty solid.
If you had to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who would that be?
It's Keaton Crawford. He's a transfer from Texas. He's was an elite special teams player for the Longhorns, but didn't really get much of an opportunity to play on the defensive side of the ball. And that's why he transferred to Nevada with Jeff Choate. I mean, he's a guy who believes in the system, knows the system, and wants to prove he can be an NFL player in terms of being a defender. I think, he's kind of proven he could be an NFL player as a special teamer, a core four kind of guy, but he wants to play safety at the next level. So, not a lot of people nationally know about Keaton Crawford, but I think that's a guy who could be an all Mountain West player at the end of the year.
With the spring practice now over, which position group or groups do you feel is the most concerning?
Wide receiver and defensive tackle. I mean, those are the two that I think you look at and you have to have the most concerns about. In terms of the strongest ones, I think middle linebacker is strong. I think safety is strong. I think those are probably the two that you feel most comfortable with. I know Jeff Choate's happy with the quarterbacks, but just given how Nevada's thrown the ball the last couple of years, I'm not sure that you can be like fully bought in that you got guys that can lead you to at least a bowl. So yeah, they're definitely the roster's not fully put together. It's a first year staff that inherited a team that's 4-20 over the last 2 years. So there are a lot of areas that needed to be upgraded. I think some of them have been upgraded, but certainly the roster's not in a position to compete for a conference championship in 2024.
Now, there's a couple guys that are still out there in the portal. Does Nevada have any scholarships to offer? Anybody that might still be available? Is there anybody that they're looking to, or like any position group that they're looking to add to?
I think wide receiver was the biggest area of concern just because they had some post-spring camp departures. They lost 2 players to the SEC that they weren't expecting to lose to the SEC. So I think that was difficult for them to stomach. Delvon Campbell, I think, could have been an all-conference player at wide receiver, but he transferred to South Carolina. And that one was difficult. He was a pretty solid player the last couple of years, and Darian Wiley went to Vanderbilt. So those are tough losses. There are a couple scholarships out there. They do start spring camp or fall camp in July 24th, so they don't have too much time if they're going to add someone, but I wouldn't rule it out.
When it comes to recruitment of new players and retention of existing players, how has the NIL and the transfer portal impacted Nevada?
It's impacted them. I mean, Nevada's not strong in NIL. You look around campus, and Nevada men's basketball's got a pretty big NIL pot. This has become a basketball town over the last 20, 25 years. Nevada's been to the NCAA tournament, almost a dozen times. They've won more than a dozen conference championships since 2000 on the men's basketball side. So there's been more interest in fans and donating to, projects and NIL. They're about to open a $12 million locker room for the men's and women's basketball team, whereas the football team doesn't even have an indoor practice facility, and it snows in Reno during the winter. There are 100-degree temperature in the summer. There are air quality issues from wildfire smoke in nearby California. So there's definitely a lot more enthusiasm over the last decade for putting money into men's basketball than football, and that has impacted where Nevada is, with its football program in terms of NIL. That's why this Jeff Choate hire was so important. Like, he has to be that home run hire. He has to get people to come back out to Matthews Stadium. He has to be the person who gets people invested and engaged in this program to build up those NIL pods, to get the Wolfpack the facilities required to be a championship caliber program. And, this was one of the best FCS programs in the nation during the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s. They went to the FBS. They had early success, but since 2000, just 2 conference championships, the WAC title in 2005 and 2010, both under Chris Ault. This program's not had a lot of success outside of the Chris Ault years. He's had 3 different tenures since 1976, and they've always won under Chris Ault, and they've always struggled without him. So I think this hire at Jeff Choate by relatively new athletic director Stephanie Remp is definitely her biggest hire in 2 years with the Wolfpack, and it needs to get Wolfpack fans in Northern Nevada back invested into football again.
Well, it seems more and more like the demands of the head coach are turning into more of a general manager type role between recruiting the seniors in high school, player retention, fundraising, and less is the X's and O's. I mean, I know Coach Choate is relatively new there, but are you seeing this in his short time there at Nevada?
Yeah, I mean, this is an enthusiastic guy. Like, you interview him and you get motivated. You want to run through a wall for him, as they say. Like, I think he's got a ton of passion, and I think he's very engaged with the community. I think he understands his role as kind of the face of the Wolfpack to a degree. I think he understands the pressures and demands to win games to create revenue for the rest of these programs. I mean, Nevada football lost $3.5 million last year. And they played a $1.6 million game at USC, and they still lost $3.5 million. Like, you can't be losing that kind of money in football as a group of 5 school and be successful. So, I think Jeff Choate's going to be very involved with the defense and the X's and O's, but he also understands kind of the overall role of a head coach and getting his team enthusiastic about playing football and getting the community enthusiastic about his team. So I think that's a strength for Jeff Choate. I think this is a guy who, you can see his passion, you can feel his passion. And I think that it's not just about the community, that's the players as well. I think the Wolfpack players are really excited to see, what this new era lies ahead for them.
Given all the changes with the coaching staff and personnel, what does success look like in 2024 for the Wolfpack?
So it's a 13-game regular season schedule. 10 of those teams were in bowl games last year, so it's a tough schedule. The two FBSs that they play this year that weren't in bowl games, Hawaii and Colorado State, Nevada's lost to both those teams in each of the last 2 years. And then the FCS school, Eastern Washington, usually one of the better FCSs on the West Coast. They weren't very good last year. That might be a little bit of an easier game. I think if Nevada goes 5-8, that's a successful season. I think certainly 6-7 is successful. Requiring a bowl, I think that's a little bit outlandish. Jeff Choate did say in an interview with me early on that he wants to be the most improved team in the FBS in terms of win total. So to do that, they probably got to go from 2 wins up to 8 or 9 wins. I wouldn't forecast that given the schedule. You're talking about Minnesota, you're talking about Oregon State, you're talking about SMU, you're talking about Boise State. The Mountain West isn't a great conference in football anymore, but it's still pretty solid. But when you're playing 10 bowl teams and the last 2 years you've only won 4 games, I think 5 wins is definitely a passing grade. I think if you get to 6, I think that's a very, very strong showing that this is a new Wolfpack and that the program is headed in the right direction and the coach they have is the right guy.
Well, Chris, is there anything else that you want to share with us or things that we should know about this 2024 Nevada Wolfpack football team?
First of all, Wolfpack is 2 words. I know a lot of people get that confused. North Carolina Wolfpack is 1 word. Nevada Wolfpack is 2 words. Nevada is in the city of Reno. It's not in Las Vegas. A lot of people get that confused. Las Vegas is actually an 8-hour drive away. San Francisco is only about a 3.5-hour drive away. So we're a little bit closer to San Francisco than we are to Las Vegas. I think Jeff Choate's going to be one of the more entertaining, quotes in the FBS. I think if he can get this program turned around, I think a lot of people nationally could fall in love with him because I think, he's got a cockiness to him in a good way. He's got a confidence to him for sure. This guy who came from the high school ranks, he was an athletic director and a football coach for about a decade there, and built his way up. And, he's been at Boise State, he's been at Florida, he's been at Washington, he's been at Washington State, he's been at Texas, he's been at some very good programs. I think that Boise State game is going to be interesting. I know he wanted that Boise State job a couple times. They never gave it to him, so he goes back to Boise State this year. I think that'll be a fun game. He's got a history of beating the rival. When he was at Montana State, he was 4-0 against rival Montana. He was called the Grizz Slayer, even though Montana State was a big underdog in all those games. Nevada and UNLV, they're rivals. They're the only 2 Division I programs in the state of Nevada. They play for a 545-pound cannon called the Fremont Cannon. It used to be functioning. That's one of the cooler trophies in the FBS, if you don't know about that. They paint it the color of the school when they win it. Nevada has not won it the last couple of years. Traditionally, they've dominated that series. So, there's some fun stuff when it comes to Nevada football history. In your guys' pre-roll there, you had Marion Motley. He actually broke the color barrier in professional football. He's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He's one of the top 75 players in NFL history, according to the top 75 list. So he played at Nevada. It's pretty cool history for the Wolfpack. Chris Ault, as I mentioned, he's College Football Hall of Famer. Colin Kaepernick, as I mentioned, he was at Nevada for 5 years and kind of helped put the Wolfpack in the map in 2010. And then Joel Bitonio, as I mentioned, he's maybe going to be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame one day. He's a 6-time AP All-Pro. Came to Nevada. He only had one other scholarship offer at the FBS level, that being San Jose State. Nevada recruited him because they really liked how he played basketball. So this is a blue-collar city. It's a blue-collar program. These guys are usually, low 3-star, high 2-star guys that you got to develop into pro players. And Nevada's done a really good job of that under Chris Ault, not so much under other coaches. So can Jeff Choate kind of be that heir to Chris Ault that the Wolfpack's been seeking for a long time to, make this a program that's not just a bowl team, but can actually win conference championships? That's his task. And if you asked him, he would tell you 1,000% he's going to do it because that's the kind of guy that he is.
Well, Chris, we want to thank you for taking some time out of your day and spending it with us and sharing your knowledge too.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
All right. If you are watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you are listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until next time, we are the G5 Hive.
I-D-I-D-I